Everybody was kung fu fighting. Those kids were fast as lightning. In fact, it was a little bit frightening, but they fought with expert timing. There were funky Chinamen from funky Chinatown. They were chopping them up, they were chopping them down. It's an ancient Chinese art, and everybody knew their part. From a fainting to a slip and a kicking from the hip, everybody was kung fu fighting. Those kids were fast as lightning. In fact, it was a little bit frightening, yeah, but they fought with expert timing. There was Funky Billy Chin and Little Sammy Chung. He said, "Here comes the big boss. Let's get it on." We took a bow and made a stand. Started swaying with the hand. A sudden motion made me skip. Now we're into a brand new trip. Everybody was kung fu fighting. Those kids were fast as lightning. In fact, it was a little bit frightening, but they did it with expert timing. Oh yeah. Keep on, keep on, keep on, keep on. Sure, everybody was kung fu fighting. Those kids were fast as lightning. In fact, it was a little bit frightening. Make sure you have expert timing. Kung fu fighting. Hands and feet, fast as lightning. Keep on, keep on, keep on. Yeah, yeah. Everybody was kung fu fighting. Hands and feet, fast as
I wanna catch you at the right time. Not a weekday or a work night, but you're always busy, never home. Your depiction of attraction sets me up as your distraction. Waiting lately to be alone. Underneath the moonlight, I could turn it on. Driving back to your house to your favorite song. Generation of romantics, Underneath the moonlight, I can turn it on. Driving back to your house, to your favorite song. In between the movies, I can turn it on. Lighting up the dance floor to the break of dawn. Underneath the moonlight, driving back to your house. In between the movies, lighting up the dance floor.
Hey, everybody, I think we're going to get started. I know it's hard to corral people after lunch in the afternoon, and there's coffee over there if you need your last shot of adrenaline to keep on going. I just want to start our panel. It's going to be a great panel, just like every other panel in this conference. And we want to try to keep on time because we, as mentioned by Lorena in the last introduction, that there is a reception after the end of this panel in the what we call the porticos, the rooms, all the way at the end of the hall with student work that was based on a couple landscape design studios focusing on solutions to deal with the water crisis, aquifers, all the things that we've been talking about today. And again, just to repeat, as everybody stood up here, I'm just humbled by the amount of knowledge in this conference and the productive and engaging overlap, but also difference in terms of the sets of presentations. And I'm hoping that we're going to end with a bang on this final panel called Water Wars at the Border. Now, let me say that I'm excited, Gabrielle and I are excited about this panel. I am particularly because it gives us an opportunity to end our conference by moving beyond our methodological nationalist focus on Mexico and to think about water and the role that it plays in defining, challenging, and shaping relations in a regional territory across the US-Mexico border. Now, in all honesty, I cannot remember why we decided to title the panel Water Wars at the Border. And the reason, maybe the water, yeah, the Times article, but then when I sent around my email to my four esteemed panelists, almost without exception, they all said, well, we're not talking about wars. We're talking about cooperation. And so then I thought, well, no, I remembered Gabrielle and I talked about that, and I had actually ended up on this panel later. I was going to do the urbanization, because my thing is Mexico City and urbanization. But what I'm reflecting as I heard everybody's response, we got their new titles and things like that, and I thought, well, maybe it had to do with the heated rhetoric surrounding border issues in general that has permeated U.S. discourse in recent years, which have a lot to do with things beyond water, sovereignty, drugs, migration, smuggling, etc. Maybe, though, it also has to do with the accelerated interest we have in the U.S. in the last just couple weeks, although it's a long-standing problem, with respect to the Colorado River Valley and the conflicts between urban and rural states that are drawing on water, which are really in the press, even within the context of the United States, being framed as wars about borders. These are intra-national borders. But of course, Mexico is part of that struggle over that regional territory that the United States is talking about only in the context of American federalism. So I'm underscoring these things because I've come to the conclusion that besides allowing us to move into an engagement with our relationship, Mexico's relationship to the United States and vice versa, which has already been alluded to, and we could think about it, the history of varieties of sovereign projects being imposed in Mexico, whether it's the Mexicans against the Yaquis in the Revolution or colonial, the Europeans. It really does allow us to think about sovereignty. And I wanted to say put something on the table before I introduce our four speakers and what they're going to be talking about with respect to the notion of sovereignty, that I'm hoping that if it's not directly addressed in the presentations, and I have a sense it will be, maybe that's something we can talk about at the end on the final when we sit together. As Lorena has mentioned, and several people here know that I've been involved in this project on struggles over a depletion of an aquifer in Apan, Hidalgo, that it involves a struggle between ejidatarios and Corona Brewery. It's not a kind of political sovereignty question, but it's about power and who controls water, right? But what's interesting in Innaki's presentation on Wednesday night in his amazing slides, which we always come back to, he reminded us that the kind of ecology of the basin that he's developed the Lago Texcoco over is very intricately connected to Hidalgo. So and I thought to myself, well, so how is it that we can even talk about water in one space in Mexico? Because Mexico is a federal system just like the United States. You've got and the federal district is a different type of political animal, historically, than the states. Really, even within Mexico, this is an issue about sovereignty in some ways. Then, in the last panel, I want to call out Matthew's comment, and actually it came from Mario's first answer to the question about water and how we understand it. He says it's all about the territory. Well, the reality is in the political science, political sociology field that I work in, sovereignty is all about the territory. But that's a political sovereignty. So how do we think about water in a world when we are using sovereign institutions of sovereignty that are based on 18th and 19th century ideas of governance, which includes models from other times and other places. Federalism is one of those. Are these institutional arrangements, and that was an issue that came up in the last panel, the arrangements that, not that we can get rid of them easily, but if we want to think about the water issue And we want to think about these sovereignty arrangements. And even within nations, there are borders with those sovereignty arrangements, and there will be in between. So I think this final panel will allow us to address those questions. One final thing that I would say that I'm really happy we're closing with this focus with these 4 amazing speakers is there has been, and I've been reflecting, I've even shared with some of you, like I was wishing there were more GSD students at this event. They have no idea what they've missed, might I say? Yes, it's recorded, but it's not the same. But I thought, and then I was speaking to Iñaki about that, and he said, well, it's all focused on Mexico. Well, like, to me, that's the best thing about it, right? But the point here is that even though everybody's been speaking in such a grounded, and forgive the metaphor, but a grounded way about the conditions, struggles, identity, tribal knowledge, history, institutions, politics in Mexico, when we frame this about conflicts and struggles over sovereignty, it makes everything we've talked about in this last day and a half and what we'll talk about in this panel much larger significance. That doesn't mean there's a one-size-fits-all way to think about water problems everywhere, but asking questions about what is the territoriality of governance, and this is again back to Matt, is a question that is being asked a lot of places, including the Colorado River Valley. There are arrangements that people signed on to 40 years ago. Urbanization is different, the ecology is different, and do we need to be constrained by those agreements, institutions, constitutional or otherwise, law in the present? Everybody is asking this question, and we are going to address those questions in the context of this panel, which is focused on Mexico, but much broader. So we will have 4 speakers today, and they will be speaking in the order that I'm going to introduce them. I'll introduce you all now, and then we'll start with America Lutzley. Title of her talk is up there. America is a researcher and a professor at the Center for Studies on Development at El Colegio de Sonora in Hermosillo, Mexico. She has a PhD in arid lands resource sciences with a minor in global change from the University of Arizona and a Master of Social Sciences with a specialty in public affairs from El Colegio de Sonora. Her research focuses on the dynamics and issues of human adaptation to climate change, water security, and mining and agricultural extractivism. She analyzes these aspects from approaches of socio-ecological systems, political ecology, feminist political ecology, and institutions and public management. America is also a member of the National System of Researchers in Mexico and has published more than 30 peer-reviewed papers and book chapters since the beginning of her career, the most recent on conservation and climate change in Mexican localities and mining towns. And you mentioned the mining this morning in one of your questions, so I'm really happy you're with us. America will be followed by Rosario Sanchez. Rosario is a senior research scientist at the Texas Water Resources and at Texas Water Resources and associate graduate faculty and an associate professor, maybe there's some of these here, the Graduate Faculty of Water Management and Hydrological Sciences program at Texas A&M, and also a former student of Ismail, we learned, but she's her own person now. And she's co-chair of the Transboundary Aquifers Commission of the International Association of Hydrologists and founder and director of the Permanent Forum of Binational Waters. She's a principal investigator of the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Act program for the state of Texas, founder of the Transboundary Water Portal, and leader of the Transboundary Ground Research Team. Also, she's associate editor of the Journal of the American Water Resources Association and the Texas Water Journal. We couldn't have a better person with us than you're here today, and especially for this theme, so thank you so much, Rosario. Rosario will be followed by Christopher Scott. He's the Maurice K. Goddard Chair in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management at Penn State University, and his transdisciplinary research focuses on the water-energy-food nexus, water security, U.S.-Mexico, and South Asia transboundary. Oh, good, we might get a little global comparison, or at least for the Q&A. South Asia transboundary water resources policy with emerging interest in linked transboundary energy policy. which of course we should be thinking about too when we're talking about water. From 2006 to 2021, he was at the University of Arizona, where he served as the director of the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy and as a professor of geography, development, and environment. And he got his PhD and MS at Cornell University, BS and BA at Swarthmore. I won't say where you attended K-12, but it's in the yeah. And then last but not least, as he said, C.J. Alvarez is the author of Borderland, Border Water, A History of Construction on the U.S.-Mexico Divide, which was the first history of building projects on the border to focus not only on barrier infrastructure, but hydraulic engineering as well. And he's currently working on a book about the history of the Chihuahuan Desert, the largest and least known desert in North America. He grew up in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and studied art history at Stanford and at Harvard. Oh, good, you're coming home. It's really great having you here. And received his doctorate in history from the University of Chicago. He's currently an associate professor in the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. So we are in for a treat. Hold on to your seats, and we'll turn it over to America.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope you're having a great afternoon. I do, actually. I am having a great afternoon. This has been such an excellent conference. It's above my expectations in all ways. And saying Harvard is already big expectations, you know. Well, today I want to thank first Dr. Gabriela Soto, Dr. Diane Davis, and all the nice people at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies for having us here today. I want to share with you some ideas regarding how institutional design can have results that end up as institutional mismatches. And don't get very worried if you don't get the idea at first. We will speak through some examples in relation to the Rio Colorado River Basin. But also, I want to focus on this idea of institutional mismatches as a potential explanation on how conflicts happen in binational water management. So I won't stop a lot of time here because some of my colleagues will speak more about the border. As you may know, this is one of the most frequently crossed borders in the world, documented and also undocumented. It extends through more than 3,000 kilometers from the west end in Tijuana, San Diego, all the way east to Brownsville, Matamoros. This is a very, very dynamic socioeconomic region that has important presence of native tribes, unique ecosystems with endemic species, and importantly, we share several aquifers and river basins. The most iconic ones are the Rio Colorado to the west, and the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, as we call it in Mexico, that serves as part of the actual border between Mexico and the United States. So even, or in addition to the fact that this is a very dynamic region, we are also facing some challenges that have to do with these four big drivers of change in this border region. All of them boils down to population growth and population demand of water and services. Migration is a big driver of population growth in these cities. The second one is industrialization by the Maquila movement, if you know about it, during the last part of the last century, and now reframed within this new revised TMEC agreement. But also, we have very big cities in this part of the Mexican part and also the United States part. Together, the 10 states in both Mexico and the US that are in the border in 2020 had more than 100 million people altogether. And you find Los Angeles, Phoenix, Tijuana, Juarez, El Paso, and you can keep going with these mega cities across just a couple kilometers on both sides of the border. Also, this is important not only because homes when you have a lot of people in big cities, you also have higher water demands. But that is just one side of the story. We have been talking about the invisibles of water management. And Dr. Perloa talked about the groundwater, and some of my colleagues will talk about that too. But another concept that is very important for the border is virtual water. The water that is contained in products, services, processes, everything that is required by these big cities. This is an important component that is usually invisible in the binational equation of water management. In both cases, in both the Rio Colorado and the Rio Grande, the major portion of water is allocated to agricultural production of fruits, vegetables, but mostly forages for the livestock and the dairy industry, not only for domestic consumption in Mexico or in the United States, but these things go very far away, even to the Middle East or Asia. So we are exporting water in that way. And finally, we also have the problem, not a small problem, of climate variability and change. And this region is a hotspot for that. In terms of aridity, in terms of temperatures, we have seen the highest temperatures in the last 20 years in comparison to the entire last century. Stream flows are also going down. Even the Colorado River has gone down up to 20% in some estimations. So how do we manage all this? I wanted to use the word by Enrique, but I need to find some synonyms because I think it's already used. But how do we manage all this mix of things now involving both Mexico and the United States? Well, in 1944, and I will go over this very quickly so I can talk about the mismatches. In 1944, Mexico and the US signed the Water Treaty that also created the IBWC, the International Boundary and Water Commission, or SILA in Mexico, la Comisión Internacional de Límites y Aguas. IBWC reports to the Department of State in the United States, and the SILA reports to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Mexico. Actually, that diplomatic relationship, I think, is one of the strengths of this decision-making body because it's diplomatic relationships and they have an actual effect on water resources on both sides of the border. So they use the minutes to communicate decision-making and also to address emerging issues in the border without having to negotiate, again, the entire Water Treaty of 1944. At first, you will see that everything talk about salinity, sanitation, water shortages, stuff like that, but in recent years, the minutes address the effects of creeping climate change in the border. For example, you will see here improving the predictability and reliability of the Rio Grande water deliveries, and also the contingency plan for the Colorado River Basin. So I want to speak specifically of the Colorado River because it's closer to home, to Sonora State. I come from there, so. So the Colorado River, as you will see, it's a river that starts in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado State and goes down through the Grand Canyon in Arizona, crosses the international border. Well, it did before the construction of these big dams and reservoirs on the entire system. It reached the Colorado Delta and went directly into the Gulf of California. And there, it sustained a lush environment with endemic species. One of them is actually, well, two of them are functionally extinct right now. The vaquita marina, La Totuaba has a long time of being extinct. But the important part here is connected to these allocations of water between two countries. And I want you to know that I don't consider this specific example as a total problem of mismatches. On the contrary, the creation of the IBWC was in some ways addressing some of those differences of power between both countries. So before the 1944 agreement, there was the Colorado River Compact established in 1922. That Colorado River Compact included only the 7 US states that are in the upper basin, which are Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, and the lower basin with California, Arizona, and Nevada. If you look at the graphic, you will realize that 2 states take around half of the allocation of the US water from the Colorado River. So in 1944, this compact was ratified, included within the frame of the New Water Treaty, and also Mexico was given or allocated another 1.5 million acre-feet in the lower part of the basin. However, and now we know, because of all the water stress that we are experiencing in this region, that the Colorado Compact from 1922 was based on calculations of weather in a time that was abnormally wet. So with new advancements in technology, new ways of monitoring, of measuring the stream flow, we know that right now the allocations are more than 2 million acre-feet above the historical average flow for the Colorado River Basin. So this is, I think, what Diana was referring to. And this is what the media has done in terms of how they frame this connection between Mexico and the United States. Mexico has been experiencing troubles during last years to deliver its portion of the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo to the United States, specifically southeastern states. Texas is the big one there that gets angry very easily. But this was published in the New York Times, actually, in 2020. And this happened with a riot by farmers when the federal government in Mexico announced that they will use the water from the Boquilla Dam in Chihuahua to pay the water debt to the United States according to this treaty from 1944. Exactly. Well, Monterrey and Tamaulipas, and in just 1 month, it was a whole mess, desmadre. I want to use the word because it's real. I mean, you maybe don't want to talk about war, but definitely conflict has been at the core of these binational agreements. And to me, I am proud of this collaboration specifically for the Rio Colorado. It's true that it's not perfect, but it's a sign of collaboration between two countries. So, you know, I don't have to say it again, the Colorado River Basin is going through such a crisis right now. This is Lake Hoover, and these news are from 2022. You see the bathtub ring, the infamous bathtub ring. Lake Powell has another one similar to this. But also, some states have been thinking about where the water should come if we don't have more in the Colorado River Basin sources. So with all this and all the mess, how can adaptation and policy science help us to address current and potential water conflicts, not war yet, on the US-Mexico border? How can we do this? And some authors say that it's not a scarcity by itself. What produces war or conflict is the way in which we manage that scarcity, the key point to understand in these kinds of issues. So here I want to introduce the idea of the institutional mismatches. Many of you, maybe you have some idea because of the name of the institutional mismatches. But to start with some basic concepts, I understand a governance system as a collection of actors, their patterns of interaction, their objectives, the mechanisms that they choose to produce social change or social processes in any specific policy area. In this case, we are talking about policy in the water sector. So institutions, or more correctly, institutional arrangements, are the rules of the game within a governance system. These define the roles of actors, the responsibilities, the rights, the consequences that you should expect from something, and importantly, institutional arrangements also imply certain worldviews, certain cultural features, certain ways of looking at the world and the resources. So This part is very simple, but together I think it gives you a good tool or una buena herramienta to understand what can be wrong in binational management. So institutions or institutional arrangements can be classified or characterized depending on different types of dimensions. Why? Because they are different. They are connected to different parts of the world. They have specific designs according to place, to time, to culture, to everything. But here we can talk about the level of the social ecological organization that arrangement is trying to influence, the type of actor that designs, enforces, or applies these types of institutional arrangements, and the environmental regime that we are talking about for that specific institutional arrangement. Another way to see this, and this is, I know, overly simplified. For those of you that are policy scientists, I know that this is very simple to see. Like, this is not like that in the real world, right? But here I am trying to visualize in a simpler way how the governance structure or the governance space for a river basin could look like. We can use these different dimensions then to classify different types of institutional mismatches. Oh, sorry, institutional arrangements. Here you have the National Waters Law. It's a national federal institutional arrangement in the sector of water, and it belongs to the government sector. The Sonoran Institute, another organization in the Colorado River Basin, is a civil society group at the regional binational level, and it works in different types of environmental regimes. So the important part here, we can keep classifying the dozens of institutional arrangements that are in place in the Colorado River Basin. But the important thing here is that they interact in real world settings. And when they interact, because of those differences in the features that define them, they don't necessarily are coherent in the space of a governance structure. So that is the origin for the institutional mismatches. And these are gaps, incoherences among the components of governance systems which emerge from the interactions of institutional arrangements that are naturally diverse. So institutional arrangements in this case can help us to classify all these gaps that are originated from the interaction of these different institutional arrangements. And to me, if we are able to identify some of their main features, that could help us to prevent conflict even before it appears. If we can diagnose these gaps in institutional interactions, we can prevent maybe some of that conflict. This is my best desire. So let's reinterpret water conflict as consequences of institutional mismatches. And I will speed up here because I have no time left. So these are the 4 institutional mismatches. This comes from an original work by Oren Young at MIT, but I also developed some part of this during my dissertation research in Sonora State. So the first type of institutional mismatches come or is originated when you have an institutional arrangement that was created or is intended for an upper or lower level of social ecological organization, and this has to interact with other level within the same governance structure. But at the same time, the actors across these different levels of social ecological organization have different resources, different knowledge, different power, that is very important, different capacity for decision making, and they still need to cooperate. For example, in the Colorado River Basin, the Department of Interior have control over the dam system. At the same time, they have a specific framework at the federal level that should interact with the specific frameworks of the states, of Mexico, of the IBWC, of native tribes, of everybody there at different levels of organization. The second type is maybe the most intuitive. This is about the territory being defined in different ways according to each different institutional agreement. And here you can see the BML has a different type of the Bureau of Land Management in the United States have a different definition of the river basin. The IBWC has another, the Mexican government has another, the native tribes have another, and you can keep going and adding different understandings of where the boundaries are, but it's the same territory. It's just interpretation about boundaries, what can produce the problem. Number 3 is very simple. It's among official institutional arrangements, like legal arrangements in the legal framework. And here, one of the most known examples is, for example, Semarnat in Mexico has some programs or policies for conservation, but at the same time, the SADER, the previous SAGARPA, has subsidies for agricultural use, subsidies for water pumping. So you have 2 different arrangements that are contradictory in nature at the end in the field. The last one is between formal institutional arrangements and the social shared practices. We have seen this a lot, is when you have a specific design from the government, from an NGO, and then people behave the other way around. And this is informal institutional arrangements. So there are different ways of addressing them. I won't speak about them because also my colleague here, Chris Scott, is going to talk about hydrodiplomacy a little bit. There is this Colorado River Joint Cooperation process that has been going on for the last years, and it's an example of how you can beat these institutional mismatches. And I will leave these points here for the discussion on what can add to cooperation and what can add to conflict between these states towards climate change, towards more globalization in socioeconomic terms. And thank you so much.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank, of course, as always, Gabriela and Diane for your invitation, for the people that is sitting here waiting in the afternoon. And of course, I'm very honored to be part of this panel. It's the best panel ever. And it's since yesterday, I mean, you guys, you really rock. Enrique, you have, the scientific community after your presentation just reached a higher level now that we can use the perfect word for everything. I'm sure the Academy of Science will be very delighted to hear that I can quote you now, scientifically speaking. And that's great. So anyway, thank you. I'm very honored to be here and to share this bit of our experience and expertise on the border between Mexico and the US. And of course, when they said border water wars, I said, no way. I'm not going to talk about border water wars. I'm not going to put another element there into the Texas angry very easy. No way. But we certainly will address what is going on and how that can be used to support more opportunities for cooperation, because I think there are much more opportunities than threats. We just need to be able to identify them properly and negotiate and communicate. And of course, trust building among institutions across the border. I think that's the main problem. So no border wars, no border water wars, at least. I think water unites us. I think historically, between Mexico and the US, water has worked well than many other aspects of our relationship. But water has brought people to the table. And water does that, actually, not just Mexico and the US, brings people to the table. I mean, there's a reason why countries out there are usually fighting each other. The only thing that works among them is the water treaties, right? Because water helps that, it alleviates, it leverages power asymmetries across countries. So we need to take advantage of that. We also need to be able to identify the problems. Sometimes we think we know what the problem is, and it's not necessarily the truth. I mean, we get noise, we get a lot of noise, a lot of misinformation, a lot of climate change, a lot of politics, What is the problem that we need to face and we're actually trying to deal with? And that takes us 80, 90% of our time, or that should take us not 80, 90% of our time, because the solutions are there. We're not going to discover anything. Technology is so far advanced, we just need to be able to identify what the problem really is. And of course, the challenges and the conditions that we actually need to adapt and not fight against too, right? Which is not the same thing. And of course, the opportunities that we need to take advantage. So there are, and it has been addressed before in other panels, we tend to mix or to misunderstand sometimes water scarcity, right? What does exactly mean water scarcity? And the 3 points that I actually always make when they say, well, when they say, is there water scarcity? Well, it depends, right? Who are you talking to? When are you talking to, and where, right? Water scarcity means that you open your tap water and you don't get water. That might not be the case. It might just be an infrastructure problem, right? But what does it mean for indigenous community? It means totally different aspects. So we need to be able to identify what it means when we talk about water scarcity. And of course, the risk is more at national level, and that goes back to Diane's first assessment of sovereignty. Shared borders, or, yeah, I just addressed it, shared borders, right? We shared a border with water. So it's time, and I think that's what they're discussing right now at the UN in New York as we speak. Basically, how to deal with limited sovereignty now that our threats transcend borders, especially water, and of course climate. But how do you give in your power as a state? How do you give in your decision-making process, and how you have to limit yourself in the decision-making process again. So now we're negotiating borders when it comes to water. And that's very, very strong. And that's a shift of the paradigm of international relations, right? And water is challenging that. And climate is challenging that too. But that's why some countries right now are very, I guess, shy, or there's fear. How much should I commit to something that I don't have full control over it, right? And of course, the money part. So that's important to be able to understand. Another condition that we need to adapt, and I'm going to focus on the US-Mexico border now a little bit, but these are the projections for 2040, like 20 years from now or so, less than 20 years from now. All Mexico, all the US, Northern Africa, or Europe, and Southeast Asia is going to face between 40 and 80% of water stress. That's a lot. That's a condition. We're not going to fight this. We need to adapt to what is coming. If it's a climate-related condition, it's climate-related condition, but we're not going to change it, at least not in the short term. So we don't get lost on the noise that we're seeing right now. The conditions, and I'm going to focus a little bit on the Rio Grande because America already talked about the Rio Colorado. But the population in many border cities will duplicate in the next 30 years. The trade between Mexico and the US is $1 billion every day. It's not going to stop. Population growth is not going to stop. If the border were considered a single country, it's the fifth economy of the world. Fourth and fifth, it depends on the year. It's not going to stop. More than 20% of the US jobs are linked to trade along the border. It will not stop. It will only increase. Municipal use, water use on the border will increase by 100% in the next 50 years, and industrial use by 40%. It will not stop. What is going on in our basins? They are both overallocated. They are both in dire condition. America already talked about the Rio Colorado. The Rio Grande is not in a better shape at all. It has lost 83% of its natural flow on the basin, and it's considered one of the most water-stressed basins in the world as we speak. Annual precipitation will remain variable over the next century. It's not going to change. This what really means is we can't rely on weather or climate anymore to plan. And that speaks to the usual strategy of the Mexican government in this sense, waiting for a hurricane before October so they can comply with the 1944 treaty allotments to Texas. That hasn't happened. That didn't happen 2 years ago, and that was MENA 325 that I'm going to cover in a bit. And of course, the aridification process of the landscape of the border region is in process. It will not stop. Now, this is the new normal. This is the new normal that we need to adapt, right? We are seeing pictures all over the world. This is not just between Mexico and the US. This is not just between our shared basins. This is Europe. This is Asia. This is Africa. This is everywhere. This is the Rio Grande last year, over 100 kilometers of basically dry bed of the river. You used to cross there by boats. And this year is not getting any better. The symptoms that make noise, this is water allotments or water allocations from Mexico to the US according to the 1944 treaty. And you'll see this is the one. This is this cycle. Every 5 years there's a cycle which Mexico needs to give to the US this amount of water, 1.7, blah, blah, blah. And this is where we are right now. The question, we have 2.5 years left. The question is, will Mexico be able to provide the amount of water that is required by the 1944 treaty? I can tell you right now, it will not be able to do it. So, oh my God, this is being recorded. Okay, I'm not going to Mexico. So, last year, CLA reported the levels of Amistad Dam, 40% of its capacity. That's breaking news. It was never that way on the years before. These are all the cycles. The questioning, and I know for a fact that commissioners are working very strongly on developing a new minute to address what is expected to happen, the impossibility of the basin to give more water or even to comply with the treaty. It's not that Mexico doesn't want to pay water. It's just there's just not enough water in the basin anymore for all the new water users, for all the expectations, and not even to comply with the treaty. There are opportunities, believe it or not. There are opportunities, and they're working towards that. Probably by the end of this year, we'll know more on how this may work. It might be a similar to MENA 323, ideally. I am not sure because Texas gets mad very easily. According to America, I'm going to quote that. That was great. By the way, now, this is good news, believe it or not. Climate change and conditions that we deal with climate change. We all say, we always blame climate change for what we are seeing, right? IPCC report last year reported that what we're seeing right now in terms of water has very little to do with climate and a lot more to do with management of our water resources. And this study from UC Davis also shows that. This is from the Rio Grande Basin. And on your right side, you see the Rio Grande regulated natural flow. You see wet periods here. You don't see wet periods here. What you don't know is that this model includes climate change, which means that the major impact on the basin, on the water availability, is a management issue, not a climate issue, which is good news. It means we can do something about it, right? It's not going to be easy. Nobody said it will be easy. But this is the divorce of the natural flow. This is the treaty. This is the first reservoir. This is the regulated flow. This is the natural flow. It got divorced. That's how I explain it. It's easier to understand that way. So what's the problem then? Well, the problem is management. The problem is the model. The problem that the model that we have of water allocation, distribution, usage, prioritization, limits is not working, right? It's not working. It's not just the US, Mexico. It's not working everywhere. The no limit kind of model and the water being considered as an infinite resource is not working anymore. The climate just told us that very simple. You can't rely on me anymore. There's just no more water in the system for you right now. And it's pretty clear. So the crisis is much more on surface water, and I'm inclining now to get into groundwater a little bit. And food. Last year, California reported that the San Joaquin Valley, which is the food basket of the world, will need to reduce at least 500,000 acres of agricultural land just to be able to comply with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of the state of California. So that means prices are going to up, and we are seeing all that. We're going to have a big effect on agriculture, on pricing, and what comes after that. So groundwater as a strategic resource now is on the rise all over the world. And that's why the UN last year conference was on that, because precisely what we're using right now under these conditions is groundwater. The problem is that we do not know much about this. We don't have enough data. We don't have enough resources. We can't rely on an invisible resource. So what is the problem behind the current model? And that's what we're talking right now in New York. Inclusion. We missed that part. Too, okay. Participatory community. Education, of course. How many universities in the US have a degree in hydrogeology? Do you know the answer for that? None. Just so you know. Socialization of science. Translating science into a desmadre word. That's a perfect example. Cooperation and effective communication. Yes, we talk to each other, but let's do it more effectively. Make it work, right? Building trust, capacity building, all that. Now, transboundary waters, is there a threat or opportunity? Around 2 out of 5 people in the world rely on shared basins. 40% of the people in the world rely on transboundary aquifers, the invisible. We have no more than 7 agreements in the world that deal with management of groundwater. So that's where we are in terms of data sharing, in terms of knowledge, in terms of commitment, in terms of management of our most sacred resource right now in the world. And we published this, this is the latest, I think, 2 years ago, between Mexico and the US. We have at least 28 transboundary aquifers, non-regulated by the 1944 treaty. We don't know what's going on in there. It's tierra de nadie. We don't know how much water has been extracted. We don't know the conditions. We don't know the quality. We don't know how much there is left. And this is what it's feeding right now, our border region, and what it will feed the growing population expected for the next 30 years. And we just don't know much about it. But it's key for resiliency, and it will be the key for future negotiations. So the challenge is huge, but the opportunity is real. And I'm going to skip to this. And the 1944 treaty, what is the problem that all the agreements on water have right now around the world? Adaptation, right? Especially to climate, new conditions, new normal. Well, 1944 treaty, Mexico, US, they don't have that problem. We do not have that problem. We have the perfect built-in instrument. I don't know how they designed it. I don't know how they did it, but it's perfect. And it's an example worldwide. The minute process. Minute 323, signed in 2019 between Mexico and California, is a whole new treaty. It's just a whole new treaty. If I don't have water, you don't get water, and that's it. Right? Correct me if I'm wrong. If I have 10, you have 5. If I have 7, you have 3. If I have less than 2, you're not going to get any more water. Mexico, I am so sorry. That's what it says. Now the question is, will we be able to do the same between Mexico and Texas? America says she doesn't think so. But that's what's at stake right now, because Mexico is not going to be able to do it. Are we going to be able to negotiate a simile of 323 to see, well, Mexico and Texas has a different story. They're a divorced couple. They can't get over with. And, you know, there's history. And you guys know history better than I do, right? So Texas, Mexico has a history. It has a weight, specific weight. How do we deal? But there's the opportunity if we can forget about our divorce. So the areas of opportunity, small steps, so we don't get anyone angry here or there. Definition of extraordinary drought, what about that? Proportional reductions of agreement to availability levels, would that be the case? And in parallel, of course, and a lot of things that they already spoke here. The limits, that's the big word that I want you to take with you today. Limits. We don't like it. It's against our model of development, our model of thinking, but that's the key. We need to set limits. It's time to get those limits set. And with that, we all have to give up, right? We don't have water here today. We just got one bottle for each one of these speakers. That's it. You deal with it the whole day. So we're giving up. Everybody has to give up. Thank you. Perdón. ¿Qué hice? Perdón.
Thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to give this talk after those last two, because they've not only set the stage, they've basically given my talk for me. Not quite. I hope I'll be able to add something. It's wonderful to be able to work, certainly with the two of them. Rosario and I collaborated over the years on the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program, TAP, and America and I, including on mismatches and other things. She was one of my best students in that interdisciplinary program at the University of Arizona. Let me just mention that the graduate interdisciplinary programs at the University of Arizona in arid land studies that she got her PhD in have 60 years. So it was created in 1962, and so this is one of these interdisciplinary programs that has been running for 60 full years, focused on territoriality. And she not only got the PhD there, but is way ahead of me. So let me tell you, I'm here holding on to my chair and my seat. Thanks all very much. I wanted to propose a couple of things. One is to pick up some case studies looking at this issue of, yes, in a broader context of cooperation and collaboration that the treaty provides, and I'll give some very brief remarks, but I think Rosario has captured it much better than I would in a lot more depth. But look at conditions in which conflicts and, yes, in fact, wars, if it's not necessarily armed conflict at the border, but situations of violence have arisen. And then the question I think we have is what are the mechanisms, formal and otherwise, to be able to resolve those conflicts, to not have long-term, more pervasive types of ongoing conflicts that could be characterized as wars. Briefly, the United States and Mexico have years of cooperation as well as flashpoints, and thanks again, Matt, for that word. I'm going to come back to flashpoints. That was in your talk this morning. And speak about hydrodiplomacy, and this is again the relationship that water at the border has played not just among the engineers of CONAGUA and the Bureau of Reclamation and others who build the infrastructure, but the soft infrastructure that we have, those cooperation mechanisms, including treaties, commissions, minutes, but also a set of cross-border communication arrangements and so forth. So hydrodiplomacy, I think, is centered on the 1944 treaty, but that there are also a set of these minutes, groundwater agreements. And I think a key role is played by the IBWC SILA, International Boundary and Water Commission, Comisión Internacional de Límites y Aguas. SILA IBWC has some real pluses and some real minuses, in my view, looking at sort of that middle layer of institutions, which is below the level of law and policy, but maybe above, in some hierarchical sense, the level of local practice. IBWC SILA is a durable, pervasive, robust organization. It was created, as America pointed out, in 1944 as a result of the treaty, but it was predated by that as the International Boundary Commission. So the IBC became the IBWC with the 1944 treaty. So it's very much a late 19th century, early 20th century institution in the way it works, in the way it thinks, in the way it functions. And that is both a plus, that it's got staying power. It is a robust institution. It's here and there for the long haul. But it It is a 1940s era sort of institution with its own baggage that it brings, but I think it does provide a level of stability and predictability in institutional affairs at the border. Let's also set water in the broader context of U.S.-Mexico border relations, clearly around trade and environment, the way in which USMCA basically replaced, but in fact built on to a significant extent NAFTA that came before that, and again with its issues and challenges, particularly with commodity flows at the border, food trade, but manufacturing and all the issues that America also referred to. But it did create also some durable, longer-term institutions that are part of the institutional landscape that I think we have to take account of as we understand things. NADBank, BEC, and then was replaced and subsumed under NADBank. And of course, with Canada, too, part of there's the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, but let's not address that as much. And looking at America's Rubik's Cube, I think it's really interesting to look at the role of NGOs and civil society. So we think of formal institutions at the border, the IBWC, the treaty, but we also very clearly have a set of very active cross-border, binational in not only their operational arenas, but in fact, the way in which they're constituted, formed, established, the way in which they operate, raise funds and money and so forth. Sonoran Institute is a good one, but there are many others as well. But also we have points of direct and formal contact between mayors and municipal governments at the city to resolve issues that arise on an environmental level, but also law and order and a range of other things. And I don't mean formal border sister cities that they define that such way, but the fact that at all along the border where there's a Mexican city, there's a U.S. town. And I'm using that sort of intentionally because the population numbers almost always dwarf on the Mexican side the U.S. population, often by a factor of 10 or more. So Juarez will have 2 or 3 million people, where El Paso will have 200,000 or 300,000, et cetera, along the border. And not exclusively, but I think it's important to also keep some of that in mind. And I'd like to set this in a broader sense of science diplomacy, that the two countries have been collaborating extensively on questions of not only at the border, but in a binational sense. And I had the pleasure of being involved in a consensus study that was put on between 2019 and 21 by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine and the Academia Mexicana de Ciencias in a binational process to look at environmental and other challenges, not only at the border. I kept pushing for a binational region and a binational context, and there's a set of reports that are out both in Spanish and in English, so that it's really a binational effort that results from that. I won't go into this too much later, in too much more detail, other than to draw your attention particularly to that third point, that this is also a region in which, and Diane mentioned this, where there's very strong interstate tensions within the countries. So Chihuahua, Nuevo León, as well as Tamaulipas, have no love lost when it comes to water and water management arrangements, just as Texas and New Mexico are fighting and have points of conflict in the upper Rio Grande Basin, as well as those other states that America mentioned in the Rio Colorado Basin. But it's also important to mention, and this is, Dan, I don't mean to pick an issue, but where the federal systems of water management actually in Mexico and the United States are very different. So CONAGUA has no counterpart organization in the United States, and the role in which Texas able to say, we're going to put our foot down here, would not be possible by Tamaulipas or Nuevo León within a Mexican federal arrangement around water resources. So there are some very clear differences that we need to account for. Here's what I wanted to do with flashpoints, and I came up with this slide a couple of days ago, so I'm glad Matt mentioned this, because I wanted to bring this idea that flashpoints are things that arise, but that possibly in contexts with the right institutional settings and mismatches, it could be potentially arranged, can have some resolution. And I want to propose a new word. What we have to do is remadrear the desmadre. Okay, so I think we're partly here to look at what the solutions are to put the madre back together, to not only have situations of desmadre, but to maybe have some ways to go forward. So flashpoints, and I need to look this up, is actually the lowest temperature at which vapors above a volatile combustible substance can ignite in air when exposed to flame. So you need to have a couple of conditions there. But the second point is, and this is what I think we see at the border, a point at which someone, somebody, some country or some interest group at the border bursts suddenly into action or being. And we see this coming up in a couple of contexts. I'm going to look at two of those with you that really have features of transboundary tension, but with the possibility of remadreando the desmadre. So in the Rio Conchos, we've referred to the case of Chihuahua. For the translators, I'm sorry, I always do this. I get a little bit like I've got to cover my content. Okay. That was the first one that I went and talked to them at the break, and I said, I hope everybody's speaking, well, and do you get that? Do you have the Mexican idiom so that you know all those expressions? And, but thank you very much, and I'm sorry for rushing. Okay. I'm so excited here. So the Rio Conchos in Chihuahua and the Rio Grande border with Texas, what is the temperature volatility of that particular flashpoint? Well, I do think that drought tests the treaty provisions. Rosario said it's not just drought and climate change, but clearly there are other things. But what was the ignition? Well, this October 2020, Rio Conchos water release from La Boquilla, and I remember getting the call from Natalie Kitroff, who wrote that article, and said, could you comment a little about what the possibilities for, some mediation or something? And I'm on the record in that article by saying, no, we have institutionality and we have ways for dealing with this. And I'll refer a little bit later to some of that. But what were the flames? And I think this is something that across binational relations, and certainly in the border context, is there very strongly nationalist policies at that time, certainly in both countries, and Texas, and that was also before we had our talk this morning, so I didn't add this just at the last minute, right? And so there's that very strong sense of sort of a nationalist interest. I'll go through that case very briefly. I want to refer to another one that probably has gotten less press attention, but where we are in the western part of the border in Ambos Nogales. That idea itself conveys that there's something shared. I've often said in these talks around borders divide us, but borders are also what bring us together. I mean, borders are the points in which the countries contact and need to have points of communication, points of exchange, and so forth. So yes, there is division, but there's also, I don't say unity, but there's contact and communication. But in the Ambos Nogales, both of these, interestingly, are around infrastructure, where both rampant urban growth and inadequate planning and zoning were the temperature and volatility context. And the ignition was a leaking sewage main called the International Waterfall Outfall that was leading water to the Nogales International Wastewater Treatment Plant. So the two countries treat the water together, but at a plant that's located because of its gravity position downstream in Arizona. And so IBWC has a role to play there. What was the flame? I think Arizona was pushing, and the Arizona delegation in Congress, including both senators and representatives, in the U.S. Congress, we're basically pushing to keep the water. So let the water keep flowing, but if we have an issue and a challenge of leaking water, it's that Mexico needs to pay for the cleanup, not necessarily just to repair the outfall intercept, but also to pay its treatment costs at the plant. So let's look at both these cases just in a little bit more detail. We've seen this now for the third time. This is from Natalie Kitroff's October 2020 paper that I think partly gave its name to our session here. And yes, there was conflict, and certainly there were looming fights and threats of violence and actual contexts of violence. So I don't want to minimize that, but I do think it was set in a broader structural arrangement where the two countries have both a treaty but also have a commission structure to be able to deal with it. And Rosario presented this graphically and presented this actually in a much more eloquent way than what I've done, is to copy and paste some of my colleague and our colleague and friend Steve Mummy, who, if anybody really wants to understand, I think, border water at the institutional and legal level, please read Steve's work. He's at Colorado State University and really a defining person in this broader area. But this whole idea that the treaty was built in with flexibility arrangements to account for certain unknown things. So if we talk about invisibilities, we need to also talk about the non-visibility of crises that are looming. And can you have a flexible arrangement that will allow you to deal with that when it comes up? This idea of the known unknowns. We have things that we don't know, but we know that we don't know them. And we also have unknown unknowns, which are things that will just be thrown at us, and we have no idea what might be coming, much less how we might be able to deal with those. But there's some of the same things that Iñaki talked about with flexible infrastructure. We need to have flexible institutions that are able to sort of roll with the punch, as it were. Let's look very quickly at the next one. And sorry, this graph at the left is a little bit dated, but it does capture, these rapid population and economic growth conditions at the border. And those curves look much the same in many border towns and cities, though those data are a little bit old. But here is a picture on the right of the binational International Wastewater Treatment Plant in Arizona, but that receives most of its water from Nogales, Sonora, just because of the size of that city, and then the interflow outfall was basically broken in between and leaking sewage in the border. But here's also what wastewater and flows of sewage with and without treatment or partial and adequate or inadequate treatment actually do in a desert landscape, right? And so I think we have to understand this not as waste, but also water as resource, and clearly with a public health and a planning, necessity to do infrastructure. And so this is actually what is downstream of the disaster is actually a kind of an oasis, if you will, on the Santa Cruz River, in between Nogales, Sonora, Arizona at the border, and Tucson going further south. Let me also mention that Mexico, and particularly with federal funds from Conagua, but also with resources that went to the state of Sonora to build an infrastructure treatment plant, wastewater treatment plant, in the Alisos River Basin, which is not where the natural flow of water would go downhill, but Mexico pumps the water. And this was another master's student, another student of mine doing a master's at that time, was the sort of point of uphill both ways, right? Like we complained that, I had to go, but it was both hill. It was both ways uphill. Well, Mexico does pump water up and over into Nogales, but then when it collects its wastewater, it pumps it sort of back over. So there really is a lot. And this is where some of the energy interests that I came in with, and not so much how many kilowatt hours does it take and what's the pump size, but sort of how do you manage energy for water and water for food, and a lot of these kinds of integrated resource management types of questions. So if we talk about a territorial complexity, we can also talk about sectoral complexity. Now here are the two commissioners. I'm glad to see that both are women commissioners. I mean, I think it was high time that we really got some diversity into the IBWC and SILA. Another person who played a very important role in the resolution of the Boquilla conflict was Blanca Jimenez, who was the Directora General of the Conagua at that time. So I do think there's a plurality of governance participation in these systems, and I think that speaks well to its broadening out. It's not just the domain of the trained civil engineers and so forth, but that I think we can really look at more plurality in participation in some of this decision making. To end with, I have a couple of points that I wanted to mention to you. That transboundary water is a governance question as much as it is a policy or a local flashpoint question. What I mean by that is water is a fluid resource. We really have to think of some of these long trajectories of the situations that we're working on. I think the notion of a shared resource is not only there at two countries, but also interstate. On the water wars concept, it wasn't Natalie Kitroff who brought that up. This idea has been around for a long time. The one who popularized that on the international stage was Ismail Serra-Geldin back in the 1980s, who I guess 90s there, but already was speaking about that, which was this notion that water is going to be the new oil and we're going to be fighting over this. But it's been shown that institutions have largely been robust, though there have been flashpoints. So I want to say no war, but flashpoints that find some resolution. Political science has this emphasis on peace and conflict, and so it's not peace, but it's interspersed with periods of conflict. So we sort of have, temporality, intermittency that we were talking about in water supply, but I think we also have that in our conflict and situation. What I did want to mention briefly at the end, what I think to me really helps explain this local conflicts that arise, but that there's binational cooperation at a longer level. Is this a paradox? Well, not really. Robert Putnam wrote in the 1980s about what's called the two-table hypothesis. So you can actually be negotiating things at the same time. You can be talking about a long-term treaty arrangement between two countries while at the same time on a different table, a different negotiating point be attending to conflicts and so forth. So I think this has a storied tradition in governance and political administration. So I want to say that we're moving from flashpoints to not full cooperation. We're, kumbaya under the tree all the time. No, there will continue to be points of differences, and we need to understand how to express those, but with an intermediate level that's not at law and policy and not only at local levels, but sort of this intermediate level of governance. National water institutions, I think, see opportunities there. This two-level, two-table hypothesis that I brought forward, I think, is something that we need to understand better, that these things operate at the same time. Trust building, we talked about that very briefly. The social environmental impacts must also be addressed, but also internalized and not simply thrown out, okay, we'll do an EIA statement to address those, we have to do something. I think there's real opportunities in coordinated climate action and continuing along this line of hydrodiplomacy and science diplomacy. That's all I have for you today, and thank you very much.
All right, you all are about to hear a very different kind of talk from me after my esteemed colleagues. So, echoing the thanks to Gabriela and Diane and to Paola for bringing me out here, and to the interpreters. I know it's been a long day, so this is your last, you're almost done. Like Diane said, I'm back. I went to grad school here at Harvard, and one of the things that I noticed walking around yesterday is, the Border Cafe is closed. I used to go to the Border Cafe all the time. It was like for kind of comfort food when I was here. Daedalus is still there, the old kind of watering hole. And it's so interesting to me how we notice the changes in the landscape of consumption first. But then what I did is I went to the Charles. I went to the river. And this is a habit that I've gotten into as I've given lectures about the U.S.-Mexico border throughout the United States and Canada and Europe, is I always go to the river, whoever's river it is, wherever I am, before I give a talk about border water. And this is part of a discipline that I've tried to develop of paying attention, of noticing, of staying found, of understanding the environment in which I find myself. And so it's very good to be back, and it's also good to see that Charles is right where I left it, and right where the Massachusetts left it, and right where basically the glaciation of the Pleistocene left it about 14,000 years ago. Interesting, it's a very young river in comparison to the very, very ancient rivers of the border. This is another preoccupation of mine. And it's a lot cleaner than it was when I left 15 years ago as well. So there's a positive outcome. Most people in the United States, most people in Mexico have never been to the U.S.-Mexico border. Or if they have, they've been to one place, and they tend to extrapolate from that place about all border conditions and all border places. And so I want to talk to you a little bit today about border geography, how I have imagined not just border geography, but alternative geographies and perhaps more effective ways of looking at the border region. I also want to share with you some of my intellectual preoccupations that include ecocentric approaches to history. I'll speak more about that in a little bit. The question of ambiguity in border history and context, something that is often de-emphasized in the face of controversy. And chronological scale, based on the premise that how you determine the time frame of whatever it is you're talking about raises completely different questions and different narratives, and forces you to adopt different kinds of vocabulary for describing meaning and importance and urgency and even sustainability. So these are the ideas that I try to work through in border studies. I like to start always everything I do with satellite images as again an exercise in denaturalizing political divisions, and unless you're pretty good at reading the land, recognizing irrigation districts, recognizing white sands, obviously, recognizing center pivot irrigation from above, you would be hard-pressed to find where exactly the U.S.-Mexico border is, or where the 6 Mexican border states or 4 U.S. border states are. And I find this more than just a kind of a curiosity, but again, a part of a discipline, part of an ethic of looking and questioning the extent to which we condition the non-human world, or the non-human world conditions us. So this is the map. that is reproduced countless times in academic literature, certainly in journalism. It's not wrong, but it is an exquisite example of the extreme anthropocentrism which has hijacked cartography in the 20th and 21st centuries. You do not see even the highway infrastructure that connect the $500 billion a year imports plus exports between the two countries. You definitely don't see the mountains, and you definitely do not see the rivers. And so this, to me, is an example of this unexamined premise of spatial organization, a concept that I've been developing in my new work about the desert, a condition that I think characterizes, as much as anything else does, the mentality of the 20th century. It's a condition I'm exploring and calling environmental amnesia. The experience of being in the world and having no idea where you are, and having no idea what your relationship is with water, with plants, with other animals, etc. And I think that one of the most durable remnants of settler colonialism in North America is precisely the notion that human beings are detached from everything else. And I would say that that's not just a settler colonial mindset, but that is a fundamentally Christian mindset, in which an extraterrestrial God decreed that human beings are fundamentally different than other species. And so this is kind of what I'm getting at, and what Mario was certainly getting at earlier, exploring the notion of how might we question the unexamined assumption that human beings are intrinsically more important than other animals, than other species, or even intrinsically more interesting than other species. So in my first book, I became preoccupied with these questions of cartography and how I might remedy that in a book that's about the physical divide between the U.S. and Mexico. And so I kept a running list of every single place name that I wrote about in the book, and not just political toponyms, but also mountain ranges and deserts and rivers and infrastructure, et cetera. And I gave it to a brilliant map maker of mine in the School of Architecture, actually at UT, and I said, "Can you fit this onto a map?" And he said, "Yes, I can." And he produced the map of the border that I had always wanted to see, the map of the border that took into consideration not just the political geography of where are the states and where is the international divide, and where are the rivers, but how it all fits together. So just as a quick point, my current book project is about this desert, the Chihuahuan Desert, right here, that obviously crosses the U.S.-Mexico border. I'm going to be a fellow at the Tanner Humanities Center at the University of Utah next year. So I'm going to the Western Deserts to finish this book, and I couldn't possibly be more excited about that, because it really matters to me, like where I am. It helps me think and focus my ideas. You can also see, of course, the built environment is fundamental to this. So we see not just Amistad and Falcón, and Boquilla, which we've talked about, but we also see the relative size of the rivers. And this is interesting to me, because if you look at 17th century maps, if you look at early modern maps, you see that they're quite environmental. You see that they're very clear about like what are the bigger rivers and what are the smaller rivers, because there was even in the pre-technological, pre-modern hydrological engineering moment, there was a deeper kind of environmental sensitivity, even by the bad colonizers. So one of the central premises of my book, as you might imagine, is that border land is not the same thing as border water. And now I'm going to do what every single other person is. I am horrified. I only have 5 more minutes. I can't believe that. So let me adjust on the fly here and come up with seven. Okay, seven. Okay, seven. The land border is dictated by lines of latitude. They're abstract. They mean nothing on the ground. It's the point of the line in the sand. The river border, especially the Rio Grande, the Rio Bravo for the Mexicans, is an artificious frontier. This was something very common in pretty much everywhere before the 19th century, using natural features to delineate, to demarcate political space. And I think that it's emblematic in the sense of, and we can switch over watersheds to the chamizal, which, to use another very, very technical historical term, and to just add a bit to our advanced vocabulary about borders, is a clusterfuck. This was where, between Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, and El Paso, Texas, the border ceded territory to the United States through the river moving, and then the river was eventually encased in concrete. So one of the most extreme forms of river encasement on the entire border. And I think that what we're looking at here is what we're also looking at in so many of the other projects that we've seen today, and that is engineering and policy challenges in the 20th and 21st century chasing bad decisions from the 19th century and the path dependency that infrastructure created, or the decision even to use a river, especially a moving desert river, as a border to begin with. So I was going to talk through several other examples, including the dams, but the idea is that the river sections of the border have in fact undergone far more complete and thorough human modification than any part of the fence on the land border. And this is another reason why it's analytically important to not take the bait of the fence, which is meant to be photogenic, and learn to read the hydrological landscape and the infrastructure in ways that help us to understand that. Oh, meander map of the Colorado from late 19th century. Vegetation removal. This does two things. One thing we haven't talked about, but that is important to recognize. This is from the 1930s, stabilize the river. It also created a far superior landscape for surveillance. And every aspect of hydraulic management on the US-Mexico border has been simultaneously incorporated into the policing objectives of unilaterally, although in some cases the Mexican government sort of wanted to propel the U.S. Border Patrol to policing on the border. So I will end by addressing the question of sovereignty. I would push the definition earlier than the Westphalian notion. And I think the way that we've been, in a de facto way, talking about sovereignty as a synonym for jurisdiction and administrative authority, and I would push it back to the notion of God and divine right. And I think the most important thing anyone said today was uttered by Mario when he talked about the extent to which the water is not just a thing that can be bought and sold, but rather is something that is fundamentally alive, I guess you might say. And so I think that despite all of our best efforts and our highest intentions, without an increased imbuing of rivers with a spiritual context, whatever that might mean to non-indigenous people, we have no way of moving forward. And that's how I think about the question of sovereignty in the context of rivers, border rivers in particular. Thank you very much.
have a little less than 25 minutes because we are trying to end around 5 and we're going to have some final comments from Gabrielle. But first of all, let me just thank this amazing panel. Took a lot of notes and I am going to retract my thought earlier that I won't ask a question. I would like to throw a question out. But we do want to hear from everybody here as well. So I'm going to actually want to, I'll try to turn 2 comments into 1 question, but I want to come, I'll start with where CJ ended. I was very happy when you actually mentioned, and of course I started us out by wanting us to think about sovereignty, and you said, well, let's really push back against the Westphalian notion of sovereignty, which I could not agree more. And you responded with the idea of the kind of spirituality and like God's idea. I think what I've been struggling with some of my doctoral students here and in the project in Apan, et cetera, is whether there's a kind of a biosphere grounding for sovereignty. So, which may go back to some of these historical examples we heard about from Mario. So, I mean, really, I'm thinking openly about alternative arrangements. Maybe a better word here is, and I've written a little bit about this, is imagined community, the notion that Benedict Anderson uses to talk about the rise of modern nationalism. I'm a sociologist, so I like that notion. That imagined community could be around history, culture, appreciation of the ecology. It could be around God. There are a bunch of things that will unite a community around an imagined present, maybe an imagined past, present, and future. Putting that out on the table, because that's in a way why I wanted us to be able to think about sovereignty in a panel where we're looking exactly at institutions that have been created to protect Westphalian sovereignty. So my question for the panel I'd like to ask, and hopefully it will then maybe involve some comments after we hear from you, from the audience, other speakers from earlier panels, is whether we can we learn something from the transnational experiences that you all described, the transnational institutions, the transnational arrangements, the kind of their flexibility, when they work, when they don't work, the mismatches of scale. Should we be, for those of us who want to think, let's say within the nation for the moment, let's say within the nation of Mexico, about what is the preferred sovereignty arrangement to deal with the kind of livability, the Laturian transcendence of kind of governance, human, non-human. Can we learn something from the transnational cooperation? Or is it the other way around? I mean, I guess I want to know, could we take any of the principles that have been struggled over because of Westphalian conflicts? Is there something in there that we should be looking at within nations, or possibly for the audience, vice versa? Where should we be looking? I mean, maybe we're going to give up on the idea of transnational boundary cooperation because it brings war, but on the other hand, maybe that the fact that war hovers over it because you're dealing with Westphalian sovereignty makes you do things that might solve problems that wouldn't happen if you're dealing with Hidalgo, Mexico, or Tamaulipas and Nuevo León or something like that, because there are sovereignty differences that prevent the kind of cooperation around water in the nation. So that's the general question. Can you share some insights, because you all know the transnational well, and of course internal to Mexico. So, and maybe we'll just start, and anything else you want to add on to your, based on your presentation, because I tried to keep the time. We'll hear from all 4 of you, and then we'll open it out to the audience for questions. America.
Well, thank you so much. This is a great question. It's about how we can generalize the lessons learned from national cooperation within individual states. I would like to say that conflict is at the core of these binational agreements, but also there is conflict within the river basins itself. In the case of the Colorado River, there is a piece of legislation that came from a battle between California and Arizona regarding the water that was being taken by California in the second half of the 20th century. What I have seen in these collaborations that are under the auspices of the IBWC is that they have tried to reduce the asymmetry. Asymmetry, and I named it in one of the first type of institutional mismatches between levels, but between scales or between official legal institutional arrangements. They created the IBWC with two counterparts from the Mexican government and the US government, but recently the Colorado River joint cooperation process did something even beyond that. They not only have the IBWC, but they have these continuous meetings because of the drought contingency plan, in which they meet with each other. They actually agreed on a common model for modeling the stream flows of the Colorado River. They evaluated several models and they decided one, both sides of the border, the Mexican stakeholders and the US stakeholders. They do these meetings in both languages, as we are doing here right now. That helps because even language can be a problem in these kinds of situations. They decided on one single model. One side taught the other side how to use it for decision making. And this is very important. Decision making is based on scientific evidence, the best scientific evidence possible, available, and agreed by both parts of the border, by both stakeholders. So that is a way to reduce the asymmetry in resources, because in Mexico, we maybe don't have that much modeling potential and power as you guys do here in the United States. Knowledge, values have been, like the gap between values between different groups have been reduced by these cooperative processes, because they invite livestock producers, agriculture, the agricultural sector, government, NGOs, all kinds of stakeholders to the tables. The only problem is that it's by invitation. That's maybe one of the things that we can criticize, but maybe it's also because they want to keep control of the process so it doesn't go everywhere and causes all the mess that I like that we can use this method now.
You're saying that can be used within Mexico, down, not at the border, but
in Mexico.
down in the Central Basin.
Well,
That's my question.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Asymmetries are everywhere. And in terms of attending these drought conditions, one of the problems that I have seen is that many solutions actually imply winners and losers. And that is a challenge, still in the binational relationship. But we can use the lessons. We can have these cooperative processes in which you have all types of stakeholders. You try to reduce asymmetries in resources, in knowledge, in data access, even in understandings of the world, of the models of the river basins. And that can work too for internal conflicts and disputes.
Thank you. Rosario.
Yes, thank you. I think Mexico has historically been more successful dealing with other countries than dealing with its own country. I mean, we've been very successful with at international level, water treaties or role in the United Nations. We have a long history of diplomatic successes out there. But internally, we always been fighting. We still fight the revolution and, the values and Tierra y Libertad. All those fights are still there, believe it or not. Even the war with the US is still there, believe it or not. So that is part of, I guess, of idiosyncrasia. I'm sorry, I don't know how to say that in English. And it's hard. However, that doesn't mean that the recipe is different, right? Because we have other issues. I'm speaking now as Mexican. We have other issues, but still the recipe is the same. I would add to what America was saying. It works better at a local scale. So, and I can speak for groundwater. Groundwater is very, very attached to people's localities, and I think surface water as well. It's very, very local. It's not the same to talk about the history of water cooperation between Mexico and California. They love each other. Than Mexico and Texas. not even Mexico and Arizona. It's a different story. The localities, the history, the culture, the traditions, the values, even the habits of the people are different. And that has to be acknowledged and respected. I think that the successes we have had in the border, and correct me if I'm wrong, are those that are more locally driven by local necessities, needs, and perspectives than those attempted at a macro level. And I think that could be replicated at a national level as well. We know what the recipe is. It's harder in some cases than in others. But it's, again, inclusion, stakeholders, communication, building trust, cooperation, effective knowledge, and of course science-based information, and the translation of that information into something that everybody understands, right? And that's my.
Thank you, Christopher.
Thanks, Diane. That was a probing question. I would react at two levels. So the way at least I understood it, or I'm interpreting or choosing to answer, maybe that's the better way, is that I think there's a utopian idealist future that is collective that we all need to not only imagine, and I don't mean that as an abstract process, but as an active, engaged process in which the broadest range of stakeholders, interest groups, participants in that process need to be involved. And I think taking the lessons from CJ and our panel, but also other discussions we had, that's not only human actors, so we need to think, we need to imagine how to have a more inclusive, environment, including water. I would also say that there is the sort of practical, political, realpolitik, what we can do today and tomorrow with our existing institutions and political arrangements that also has to be factored. This is not unlike the discussion we had yesterday but we are given a set of infrastructures and we are given a set of arrangements. What can we do with those because they're the ones we have, right? So we also have to be, I think, pragmatic and realist. And at least in terms of the U.S. and Mexico context, I do think we have to play or understand that there will be a political reality, that decisions are made in Washington and Mexico City that have very little to do with on-the-ground border, or at least are removed, not only spatially, but I think also institutionally. But I think that's where we have to come back to these points of border collaboration context, though they are imperfect and though they have mismatches and though they have challenges. I didn't mean to comment in my remarks, and now on reflection I think I can see how that might be the case, that the role of binational institutions is simply to extinguish flashpoints. I think flashpoints are useful for surfacing issues and for really pushing the agenda forward, much more so than a stodgy institution like the IBWC or CELA will be able to with its minutes process. I think it's effective. I think it is reliable. It's got redundancy. These are all terms also we use for resilient institutions. Maybe I'm putting it on too elevated a plane, but I do think that some of that predictability is important. Let me say that, and this is where I differ a little bit from Rosario, that the minutes framework is great. And look at the 323 minutes in the past 70 years since but I think the treaty will have to be renegotiated. I really think that you need to put a hard set on some of these features that we recognize are part of it, and not say only that minute 324 will deal with the next issue that comes up. For instance, the structural imbalance of water and the lack of availability of water. Same thing applies in the 1922 treaty, the River Compact in the United States. I think those structural deficits should be written into new treaty language. And then the final point I would mention is, let's not only think that a collective global process of reimagining, which I referred to at the beginning, which is crucially important, and I've referred to that intermediate level of the governance institutional frameworks that we have at the border, but the points of individual, human-to-human, person-to-person, personal experience with the environment that I think all of us are inspired by, drawn by. And you can tell that that's the case when we put up photographs of incredible situations, beautiful artwork, beautiful human contact situations, the lovely cases that we heard from Lisa and from Luis and others, I think just are overawing, and that's a personal interaction I think that we also have to have that motivates us to go forward.
Thank you. CJ?
Well, as you can guess by now, I have nothing to offer in terms of policy, but I think it is very interesting to think about like an updated U.S.-Mexico border iteration of Anderson's idea of imagined communities, and I think that it's safe to say, and I think I implicitly argued in my book that the 19th century border between the U.S. and Mexico was very clearly imagined in that it wasn't really there. And that through the process of physical construction, it was made manifest and it became real. But it didn't. It's still an imagined line. But the extent to which the built environment has structured our thought and conditioned our imagination to imagine, once you build a dam, it becomes that much harder to imagine the river without a dam. Once you rectify a river, straighten a river, take out the bends, it becomes that much harder to imagine the natural meanders. Once you build a border fence, even, it becomes that much harder to imagine it without that. And yet, something very interesting happened in the 1990s. It was NAFTA. And we know what that is, obviously, but what we might not know is that in that context, the INEGI, the EPA in the United States and Atlas Canada, among many other subnational organizations, all got together to begin, like, well, I guess we have this free trade agreement. I guess we should study the water quality on the rivers, and I guess we should learn something about the bioregions, the ecological regions. And over the course of years, they produced these ecological region maps that are evidence of extraordinary compromise, because people working in fish and game don't have the same idea of where environmental borders are as riparian zone people, as Forest Service people, as all the different agencies in Mexico do. And there's this elaborate documentation of how they came to those conclusions, how they developed those maps, what the lines mean on those maps, in the context of geology, human use, flora, fauna, etc. And so, to a certain extent, environmental mapping is something that is still in our heads as people. It's still an anthropocentric exercise in categorization, but there is also an extent to which those are places out there, real, in a sense, whether we name them or not. And so I see these maps that counterintuitively came out of the context of NAFTA as one potential way of environmental remembering. So if the diagnosis of the 20th century is environmental amnesia, the question becomes how might we reconceive of the geography of the border? And I think that against all odds, these maps born in the context of NAFTA, but taken advantage of by all those field scientists to be now we can actually talk to each other. Now we can actually work with one another to build these maps, is to me, and in my own work and in my own mind, in my own heart, one of the most important mechanisms that I've used personally to try to begin the process of disentangling the built environment of the imagined communities and thinking in a more holistic, non-anthropocentric register.
Great. Thank you. I want to open it out. We don't have a huge amount of time, I promised, and we want to end by 5 because I want to be able to give Gabriela an opportunity to kind of help close us out, and then we can go and talk more among ourselves. There are so many hands up there, and I was going to invite questions and or comments about the day, and I see at least 3 hands, so I'm going to ask all of you to share, but keep it short so we can hear them all. Maybe they won't get answered, but we want to hear your comments inspired by this great panel on the whole day. So we'll start with Ismael, and then we have Antonio, and then we have 2 hands back up there. Oh, well, I was going to, Ismael, you go
Okay,
first.
thank you very much. This has been certainly a fine conference, and this panel, of course, has been a truly fine panel. Congratulations to all of you. I would like to ask Chris Scott if he could add, although very briefly because of time constraints, these interstate conflicts in the framework of an international treaty. This morning, I did promise that I was going to discuss the El Cuchillos case in the context of the treaty. I didn't do it, so this is a good chance to actually go back to that, because over the last few years, there have been extractions from El Cuchillo Dam, whose waters are 100% Mexican waters, and yet part of those extractions have ended up in Tamaulipas to indirectly fulfill the 1944 treaty. And the conflict between Chihuahua and Tamaulipas that wants the fulfillment of the treaty, because that means that water is going to flow. And in the context of La Boquilla's case, it is always a temptation for the National Water Commission to look to El Cuchillo. You see? We have transferred water from El Cuchillo to Tamaulipas to fulfill, as I said, indirectly, the 1944 treaty. So I would like to have your opinion about that.
Okay,
Yeah.
we're gonna wait, we're gonna
Okay.
pile up some questions, because some of these are specific questions that you might have to like elaborate more later, but yeah, Antonio, and then we'll do the top two up there, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the presentations. I mean, we're learning so much from you. There's one thing that I'm really interested, which is these minutes of the SILA thing. You seem to be saying that they changed the treaty in a way. Okay, that's interesting from the point of view of sovereignty and from the point of view of the rule of law, lawmaking. Because I just asked a friend of mine who's a diplomat, can this happen? Of course not. No, they would have to change the treaty. So it means it's a form of lawmaking, which is what I would call an unorthodox way of lawmaking, of these strong and admirable group of people, a binational lawmaking, which is against the Constitution. And it's a ruling. I mean, if it changed the treaty, that would have to be a formal change of treaty. Sovereignty is in Congress. So if not, I will ask you to elaborate on this, because it sounds fascinating.
Okay, thank you, Antonio. Please.
Hi, Karen Feinberg, and I was situated within the Graduate School of Education, so it partly comes from that. So I didn't get to go to the earlier sessions, but the slide that got me, if you will, was the one that was talking about invisible water for urbanization, industrialization, agribusiness, climate and variability. And I'm thinking of next generations. And I'm thinking of how to creatively engage next generations in these issues. And I'm thinking about innovation. And I'm thinking about transboundary cooperation. And I think it would be really cool, perhaps as a little pilot, to create a program, if you will, that would allow next generations to understand what those mean in context with water in real ways. And I think I would be excited to see that. And I think it's a different kind of prevention intervention that you're all talking about, but it would add to understanding and pro-action, and I could go on about that, but I think there's something to that idea. So I'd just like you to consider something like that.
Thank you. And then we have one final comment there.
Hi. So I was really taken by, the scale issue that we were talking about, how the two, Mexico versus U.S., or I should say the boundary issue, and the difference in terms of whether it's the boundary with Arizona or with California. And it made me think of, a parallel situation, say, for the Indus in between India and Pakistan, and Brahmaputra between, our Bangladesh and India, in terms of kind of power dynamics. And I'm kind of extrapolating all the possibilities or opportunities that you all have laid out in terms of how things can be done better. I was wondering if there is something that we can kind of take from that approach and think about climate refugees, because that is sort of where the conflicts are going to be if they're not already. And I wonder, how much of that can be a local conflict versus a transboundary war. So, if you can talk about that in your, using the same framework that you've used for water and rivers.
Where do we start?
Yeah, right.
I'm not starving.
Tomorrow, will you not? So, I know, Gabriella is my task mistress, so she's looking at me, And we are waiting to have a beautiful exhibition with a few words with some real math. But I will give everybody, if you can just try to give your best elevator pitch short response, and then we will continue the conversation in the other room.
All right.
If you want to add.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I will try to be very, very brief in this. I have two ideas, and maybe we can connect what you are saying with this parallelism and what you are saying about teaching new generations. I am very much, I believe very much in that specific point. And also, you mentioned how we can translate science. I think that is a big depth from the scientific community to the general public, to the general society. So virtual water, people that are migrants are moving around the world. I like the idea of virtual water that is embedded in all these ideas of industrialization, food production, livestock production, and all that, because that implies that water is moving around the world. It's not anymore attached to just the border, like in a physical presence of water, but water is going around the world as our people that move around the world. So that implies that we need to put attention to the opportunities emerging from that movement of water. In the case of Mexico, Mexico exports virtual water from the desert, from the areas that are arid in the north, but it's a net importer of water at the end. So water, the things that we enjoy as Mexicans wouldn't be possible with our own resources.
The elevator doors are closing.
Sí, sorry. Yes. Sorry, I prepared a presentation of 20 minutes and we were given like 15. So, so that is one thing. And the other thing is about what makes us common as human beings. And something that needs a lot of science translation and a lot of education. That is, we have no limits. And that was already said by Rosario. Something that is common to Mexican and American people is that we don't like to accept that we need to limit what we do and our lifestyles. And in this, finding solutions for a very stressed water world, there are winners and losers. And I am saying this because with the river, the Colorado River shrinking, some states are looking at where the water is going to come from now. But not everybody is stopping and thinking for what we want the water, how we use the water, why you have fountains in the middle of the desert, why you have big golf courses in the middle of the desert, why do you want to do something in the middle of the desert, and who is going to pay for that? Not economically, but ecologically, socially. What is going to happen to the people that is going to pay for the costs without the full benefits of it?
Thank you.
And that's it.
I'm sorry. Just because I want everybody else.
I'm just quickly going to address Antonio's question because this is important. There's a lot of misinformation about that. 1944 treaty has a built-in function that is called the minute process, pretty unique around the world. The minute process was designed to amend, adapt, and interpret 1944 treaty. We have over 327 minutes signed since 1944. All of those minutes have the same legal statutory as the Constitution. They don't get approved by the Senate. They get approved by the Foreign Ministry of Mexico and the Department of State.
Department of State.
Yeah. It's pretty unique pretty powerful. So that's why when they signed Minute 323, when Mexico lost the priority under 1944 treaty because of the scarcity conditions, well, it means it's a new treaty, right? Yeah. At least for those two. Not for Texas, though.
I'm sorry, I've got to add one really quick thing that loops us, your response on that question, that loops us back to the larger theme yesterday, which is what you're describing is an interesting combination of fixity and flexibility
Exactly.
in the same
The adaptation
arrangement.
part of
And
the
we were
treaty.
juxtaposing them against each other yesterday, and that brings us to this whole new position. Christopher.
Okay, very briefly, Ismael, I'm proposing in the case of, it's not Tamaulipas or Nuevo León or Chihuahua or on the Colorado, California, or Arizona that have to deliver those targets. It's those countries, right? So within Mexico, just as in the Colorado River within the United States, the Federation will have to get involved, and I think not just to make peace between the parties, but some solution you raised yourself this morning, which is compensation. So if Cochillo water will be given, it will be based on compensation, not by Tamaulipas, but by Ciudad de Mexico. I mean, in other words, the federal government. On Antonio's point, I think I'm pushing for a little bit more formality in the treaty that will allow for the minute structure to be equally flexible, but not have to go to the lengths of actually promulgating new legal arrangements. But I think we could get into a discussion. Pallavi, your point about the transboundary in East Asia, there are very important differences between Pakistan and India, particularly on the Indus Waters Treaty, the role of the, not only the multilateral institutions like the World Bank to sign that and uphold that, but also physically that the waters were divided so that this river was given to one versus the other. I think the Brahmaputra case is much more interesting, much more difficult and challenging, and I think that's where it will lead. But maybe some of these commission structures that we're seeing here could be implemented there. The Central Water Commission in India doesn't get anywhere near to what I think we're talking about, but it could be re-envisioned and repurposed. And on the point of virtual water, when we're talking about redoing the treaty, I'm calling for a renegotiation of the treaty, not around surface water only. We've seen that it lacks groundwater. We've also talked about wastewater and other forms of, let's say, secondary or residual or additional water, but let's also include virtual water in some of the binational arrangements around legal binding conditions between the two countries.
I would say very, very briefly to conclude that there's no viable way of thinking about future generations without thinking about the past. And I don't mean the 20th century and the 19th century, because the 19th and 20th centuries are part of the same paradigm in which we live today. I mean a genuine sense of change over time, spiritually, religiously, paradigmatically, and in terms of environmental knowledge. And I know that nobody really cares about that, and nobody's going to do it really. But whether you agree with me or not, that is, I feel like I feel certain in saying the only viable way of genuinely thinking about sustainability in terms of future generations.
So we are going to turn it over to Gabriela. Yeah, we'll just stay here for a few minutes, and then, of course, when you're done, we will follow down the road for more food. And yeah,
And
right.
some liquid
and some beautiful drawings.
So first of all, let's give a hand to the last panel. For a really terrific, really wonderful panel. So I'm between you and a wonderful art exhibit, so I will try to be as brief as possible, but it's really hard to be brief after a day and a half of what turns out to be an issue when just simply speaking about water in Mexico, the complexity of this issue, but also the multiple layers of invisibility and erasures that happen both in the past and in the present. So in order to speak about water in Mexico, we need to speak about what we normally do not see and what we normally do not address. So after 4 panels that exceeded our expectations, what can we say? In this interdisciplinary conference on Mexico and water, where we brought together an economist, lawyer, biologist, activist, a landscape architect, historians, medical anthropologists, just to name a few, what do we take away by bringing together all of these people to the same table to have a conversation? The first is an issue that we need new questions. The questions and solutions of the past often did not include ethnographies, as Liz Roberts reminds us, and what could reveal, as Liz's work shows us, deeper understandings of a problem. This lack of ethnography was most often a historically calculated decision. It was better, as in the case of the Yaqui, not to understand the Yaqui tribe as a complex society, and instead paint them in broad stereotypical strokes, making it easier to disenfranchise them of land and water. We have been putting the cart before the horse by putting hypotheses and solutions before fully understanding the human, the non-human, and as Mario reminded us, the spiritual aspect, whatever that may mean for us capitalist-driven societies. What we learn here as well is that just as water takes many forms, so do the approaches to it. Enrique's Escuelas de Agua, the schools of water, is about creating community, but it's also about giving a new generation the tools to understand that science is not something that is illegible for regular people, but rather that with knowledge about water and how water really works, you can transform a society. Luis reminded us that we need to flip the model so that economics is at the bottom. Ismael told us that just as important as the water that it contains is the infrastructure. Who holds it, who controls it, and also who maintains it, or if it is maintained at all. How and who measures water was also a pivotal point. What histories do we lean on to tell our current stories of water use and abuse? Who represents water? Who represents the river? Listening to Mario, I cannot help but think of the unfairness of arguing that the river should now be given back to the Yaqui when the river is so polluted that it no longer flows. And the river that does not resemble the river that they once knew, so much so that they cannot do their traditional ceremonies. Who then is responsible for cleaning it up? Who gets stuck with the cleanup? We also learned that water doesn't always flow, and because of this, we need a new model, a model that makes us think of intermittency as a new normal in a water-scarce world. It is those who have long lived with scarcity who may be the ones to show us all how to move forward, flipping the story of those who are experts and those who are not experts. Which brings us to another point. Who is to be considered an expert in a water-scarce world? Antonio brought in the national law while reminding us that national law cannot fully encompass the rights of humans and the rights of water. A really complex and complicated question that needs to move us forward. Matthew Vitz and Iñaki Echeverria reminded us that by examining the Lago Texcoco, that there's a long history of solutions for the lake. The lake has been reimagined countless times. It has also been re-engineered, and it still fails to meet the dreams of all. Can a lake sustain the dreams and desires of a nation? We are told that there are more concessions on paper than there is water in Mexico. We have a clear problem of measurement here, but we also have a problem of alleged abundance of water. Who has more value over others? And I quote here from something that Mario said, "We are 40,000 survivors of a war of extermination. Hermosillo is 800,000 people," end quote. He says, how can we compete with a city that demands, if we're looking at the numbers as the reason for who needs water? 800,000 is much more than 40,000. America spoke to us about virtual water and how water loss is invisibilized in the crops and other products exported from Mexico. Meanwhile, CJ reminded us that in the US-Mexico border, the focus has often been on land and the built environment of surveillance on land, but that it is the rivers which are the most changed. Chris prompted us to think more deeply about the conflicts and imbalance of availability of water on the border, a place most often characterized by cooperation when it comes to water. But just as Rosario was telling us that we need to focus on the cooperation in these treaties, Chris reminds us that there's much to be known about looking deeper into the roots of those conflicts. So this takes us to some of the final points. Are we talking about diplomatic ties when we talk about the border? Are we talking about the role of science and what is needed? Or is it simply about redefining what scarcity means in these spaces? We need to lean on our past to anticipate the problems, is what Ismael spoke about when he talked about the case of Monterrey, which should not have been a surprise that there was going to be a scarcity issue. Lisa Lucero and Mario Luna reminded us of the vast knowledge of groundwater and river life, respectively, And where this is where Veronica Herrera's call is so important, to allow civil society to shape water policy and the importance of individuals and communities to do so. At the core is an issue that the models that we have been using can only go so far. And what we learn is that the models that we have been using are incomplete because they haven't been taking many of the histories, the multiple communities, the multiple languages that are spoken, and the many understandings of water. We need to bring a much more diverse group of people to the table. The very language that we use, and if what we reframe Enrique's desmadre, the key word of our conference, unexpectedly so, is to think not of the desmadre in and of itself, but the resilience of the people who, like those dealing with intermittency challenges, are able to find solutions in a world full of desmadre. What we need to think of more is the labor that is needed to make this water work, from the scientists to the users to all these stakeholders involved. And as a historian, I must end with this final sentence, that we also need to think about whose memory counts when we talk about water in Mexico. Thank you so much. I just did right now when we were listening. So, yeah. We go to the art exhibit. Yes.